and the different kinds of issues that all come together to affect the world that we live in right here in Rhode Island. We've already seen in the series so far, we've had amazing talks from colleagues from all across the different disciplines at Roger Williams, as well as some of our community partners, that the question of what impacts the world that we're living in right here in Rhode Island includes basically the entire globe, and that we can drop the pin here in Bristol, Rhode Island, and follow the stories everywhere in the world and through all different periods of our history. And so this has turned out to be a series that addresses some particular questions that have been front of mind for our students and that are aligned increasingly with our institutional mission and values and our strategic initiatives. But it's also been a fantastic opportunity to recognize the real intellectual richness that exists in our community and all of the different ways in which those conversations can be brought together in really inclusive ways. And I think that we've already seen the way that our community members have inspired each other with the talks that they've been giving. So I'll just thank everybody for continuing to be a part of these conversations. We couldn't be more excited about the group of presenters that we'll have this year, where we have both fall and spring, a full slate of fantastic again, members of our community, but also members of our academic community here at the university, but also our bigger community in the region who are going to be coming together. And with that, I'll hand things over to my colleague, Elaine Stiles, who will introduce our speaker.
Hi, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Elaine Stiles, and I'm the faculty director of the Roger Williams University Public Humanities and Arts Collaborative. And tonight, I'm pleased to welcome Assistant Professor of Journalism, Bernardo H. Motta, to speak to us about the Neighborhood News Bureau's 150 Years of St. Petersburg's Black History Project. A former environmental lawyer from Brazil, Bernardo is interested in researching, practicing, and teaching better ways to do journalism, including community-driven empowerment, solutions, social justice, and restorative approaches to reporting. And so I think this project really emphasizes all of those ambitions and represents some wonderful work in all of those areas. Before I turn things over to Bernardo, just a few housekeeping notes. We do encourage you to put questions into the Q&A module on the webinar for Bernardo for after his talk. And just to note that we are recording the webinar, just some notice on that. And if you are interested in viewing other lectures in the series, you can visit our YouTube channel, and I'll put that link in the chat in just a moment. So welcome, Bernardo, and thank you for being with us.
Well, thank you very much, Elaine, and good evening, everybody. So thank you very much for coming to this talk. Basically, what I'm going to be speaking about is what I was doing before I came to Roger Williams University. So you can see right here, this is what I'm doing now, is the Communities of Hope project, and it has a lot of what we've done in the NNB project that I'm going to talk about today. So let me just share my screen with you so we can start with a few basic contextual ideas here. But first, I just want to show you what I'm talking about as location. So this is St. Petersburg. And of course, St. Petersburg, Florida, beautiful beaches. You have Tampa here. You have the Dali Museum and a bunch of other tourist attractions. And those things are actually important for what we're going to talk about, especially tourist attractions. And very particularly this baseball field here called the Tropicana Field today. But what we're going to be really talking about today is this line here that divides the city of St. Petersburg into the north and downtown areas. They are mostly white. The northeast is very affluent, so a lot of people with money here. And the south part of St. Petersburg that includes all these neighborhoods. So when I talk about the Neighborhood News Bureau, it's actually the Neighborhoods News Bureau because we covered all these neighborhoods in South St. Petersburg. And originally, the Neighborhood News Bureau was located, and just go back here. Sorry, mouse not working very well. So it used to be located here originally. And when I moved to St. Petersburg and we started expanding the Neighborhood News Bureau. We kind of outgrew the center that exists here, and we moved to the Enoch Davis Center. So that's a lot of what the work we've done was located. And that's a community center that have a lot of different types of services for the community. But what we're really talking about today is this project. It's one of the projects that we have in the Neighborhood News Bureau. One thing that I also is part of this history that I'm telling is that I'm showing you a page from the Wayback Machine, because when we were working at the Neighborhood News Bureau, we were hacked a lot. There are people with vested interest in not letting us tell the stories. And you see that stories here, they're not anything complicated. They're not aggressive in any way. On the contrary, we're talking about projects that were telling stories from the people in the community in their own voices. We did projects with the local media. So we had a project with WSF Media, with Creative Loafing, which is a local newspaper. Most of our projects, or actually not most, all of our projects were in partnership with the Weekly Challenger, which is a community newspaper in the South St. Petersburg covering the Black community. It's a Black-owned newspaper that when I got there, they had 2 staff members running the whole newspaper. When I left, they were in a much better position. Not because of anything I've done, but everything that happened during that time. And this is the project that we created for the 150 years celebrating the first Black settlers arriving in St. Petersburg. And we started this project in 2017. 2018 was the actual 150 years of settling. And just for you to have a kind of a scope of the project, we had documentaries. So we produced 3 documentaries, 2 half-hour documentaries, and 1 full documentary, The Black Pioneers of Sunshine City. It's what's played on PBS as a full documentary, so almost 2 hours. We have the historical photos. A lot of the archive that we have here, when I click here, it's probably not going to open. Let's see. There's some of the pages the Wayback Machine just didn't save. And the reason we are using this, okay, we have at least the idea that this page existed. And the reason we are doing this is because even today, the website keeps being taken down. And every time I have to ask them to put it up, and this morning it was taken down again. So this is one way for us to see what's there. The Weekly Challenge archive, as I mentioned, is an archive, and this one will open because it's in another server. But this archive is something that we built with the Neighborhood News Bureau, telling the history of the Weekly Challenger, which was also celebrating 50 years. Okay, apparently it won't open. And this all, even the things that don't work here, is actually part of the story that we are going to be looking at here. The Olive B. Macklin Community History Project was a project that was actually started in the 90s. It was put in a server from one of the professors who worked in this project. And when we were started looking for historical materials, this was not easy available. And we found out that we had about a month to actually save all the archives, and we should start talking to the professor, negotiating with other classes, but we were able to actually save all the archives on this original Olive B. Macklin Community History Project. And then we started working with a bunch of partners in the community and other classes that created all these resources for education, resources for historians, for scholars. So everything that we have in this project also added to the project that was already there. This is to show that this is not my project. This is not a history that I can tell because it's not my history, but it's the history of how we were able to get a lot of this information that was spread all around in different archives. Many of the archives were closing down when I got there, and we had to kind of rush to save. So this was one of them. But the photos that we have here were in another archive, in another museum that was also moving to some other person's hand. So we were able to actually rescue a lot of this history, but put everything in one place so we can actually use with the community. So we created a database. We created this story maps. That's this project here, which is basically a history of the St. Petersburg Black residents that were put into both geographical and historical contexts. We did a partnership with an organization in Illinois. So they created the ways that we could create almost like a Google map that goes back in history. So it's both a timeline and a geographical way to tell the stories. And you can see here a little bit of the information. The Wayback Machine doesn't have that site. And this is one of our partners too, is the African American Heritage Trail. That's local historians. Rosalie Peck and John Wilson were, John Wilson is still alive. Rosalie Peck passed away a few years ago. But they were the first ones actually writing a book covering all this. And Miss Gwen Rees was the local historian. And she was the one actually doing, collecting all these pieces in creating this trail, physical trail. So with my students, we were able to help her create some digital versions of those trails and a whole side of the project called Methodist Town, St. Petersburg. And this one of my students, my graduate students, who actually worked on this project here with the Neighborhood News Bureau. She stayed there, and she's the one who actually represented the spirit of the Neighborhood News Bureau right now. Let me see if I can see. So we have the student bios here. This is one of the class. So Nicole Graham is the one that's the graduate student, was my assistant at the time, and she became the person who kept this history going with Miss Gwen Rees. And these are the other students who are working on the project with the Neighborhood News Bureau. So this is just a little bit of the context of what this project really is. So the beginning of this project is what happened when I started this at the University of St. Petersburg. And I was looking to understand the neighborhoods I was trying to cover, so I could teach my students more about the local history. And I couldn't find much because there was nothing that was easy to find besides the book. But the book was very thin and just had kind of an overview of the history. When we talk about the projects that we were doing, we need deeper history. We need to know more about what was going on there. But especially because the idea was from the beginning to do reparatory journalism, which in this case is kind of trying to heal the harms that journalism has done to the local population through creating journalism by the local population. I love this quote, James Baldwin quote, because it tells us a lot about what was happening in Florida all throughout this history. And we're now in a situation where it's happening again, meaning people are being forbidden to read books about local history, books that tell the story, the actual history of what happened in St. Petersburg, Florida. Everybody wants to talk about the tourist town, and we were going to see what that means for St. Petersburg, Florida. But not many people want to talk about the racial disparity, meaning even 3 years before I got there, I got there in 2015. In 2012, they passed a law to resegregate the schools, and that became a whole new mess in Pinellas County. And it became one of the Pulitzer Prize winning stories of the Tampa Bay Times called Failure Factories, and how this resegregation caused the local schools to become the worst in the country. So what we were doing for this project, when we knew what we want to do with this project, I mean, it's rich history, 150 years that we were looking at. from the arrival of the first settlers. So this picture here is the oldest pictures we could find from the families that came at that time. And basically what we were looking at, try to identify where this history was being kept. And a lot of it is not in museums, is not in universities. Some of it was, but most of it was actually being hidden in people's homes. And because people were moved from place to place a lot throughout these years because of racism and because of this tourist town project they were going to create, that history became too spread out and people just didn't have access to it. So a lot of it was to us talking to a lot of different people to try to get, to try to identify and find what was happening with this history, where people were hiding the information, not just hiding, but storing the information. And even the Weekly Challenger, even that short history of 50 years that we could have more easily, we couldn't, because the original publisher of the Weekly Challenger, he didn't have much space to keep the newspapers. So every time his storage area filled up, he would just throw whatever newspaper they have out. So we also had to find copies of the Weekly Challenger and the older newspapers to make sure that we had all this information in a way that we could start looking at the history and what happened step by step. A lot of it was trying to understand the historiography of how people were telling those stories, because the history books, they were mostly focused on the white areas. They mostly ignore what was happening in the Black areas in South St. Petersburg. So what each organization, each book, each author were trying to tell as a story, and how they were forgetting to mention what was happening in South St. Petersburg. And also how journalism itself, if you look at the historical newspapers at the time, they were either ignoring the South St. Petersburg area, or they were actively harming those populations by telling stories that were not, they were telling stories that were not the stories that were really happening. So a lot of focus on crime, for example. And if you just look at different times in history, you can compare the specific number of crimes that were happening in South St. Petersburg and downtown St. Petersburg, and downtown has always been more dangerous. But for some reason, well, the reason we know what, the history, the newspapers were focusing on the crime in South St. Petersburg, but not telling the stories of everything else, the everyday life of South St. Petersburg. One thing that was interesting to find out when I got there was the main street, one of the historical main Black streets in St. Petersburg was actually a thriving business center. And when they removed the area that was under the state, and so Methodist town mostly, from there, people who lived there were lawyers, they were doctors, they were engineers, they were people with money, and the reason they were actually removing is because of that, because they wanted to make sure that they could tell a story that South St. Petersburg and the Black population there were not able to become successful, when all the evidence showed the opposite. And that happened in many other cities and towns all over the United States, and St. Petersburg was one of them. So we were trying to use journalism also to educate. So by bringing this history back, what we were doing, so working with the local schools and creating curriculum for them too. So we were working with Academy Prep, we were working with 3 schools that had a program called Journalism. So it was elementary, middle, and high school. And we were starting to use journalism to tell the stories and get more oral histories with their grandparents, with their parents, but also started identifying resources that we could do to create actual curriculum for those schools. And of course, once we start doing better journalism, we can do better history too. So most of the history that we tell today is based on journalism, right? It's based on newspapers of the time. So if the newspapers of the time were telling a terrible story about these neighborhoods, of course, they were not, the history is not going to be great. So that affects the population there too. And one of the things that I found out when we were doing that project, actually even before, is that whenever you talk to someone young and they look at the city in that area, you don't have a lot of historical buildings still left. There are very few that are still there. So they always thought that there was no history there. And because they didn't learn from any books, so as James Baldwin was saying, if they don't learn from any books that they had a history, that they had a thriving neighborhood, that they have doctors, they have a bunch of people who are very successful in what we're doing in that area. The young people in those schools, they thought that there was nothing there for them to be proud of. And once we start doing this work, you can see that in only 5 years, the change was amazing. Not just because of us, but because of all the partners that were working with us and how we start connecting everything with the schools, with the university, with the political scene too. So to start bringing some change and bring some healing to those neighborhoods. The type of critical historiography that we were working with was based on Carter Woodson. We worked with the museum there that was called the Carter G. Woodson Black History Museum. And it was pretty much the way that he was working with history too, by uncovering history from the Black experience and showing that it was not just the bad stuff that the white people were talking about them, but there is a lot of rich history of building community, of learning, of education. So I think it's very important for us to always go back to that idea that this was not something that people came out of slavery and they didn't do anything. It was taken from them over and over and over and over again in history, as we're going to see in a second. So the ways that we were working in the Neighborhood News Bureau to create this project was trying to create this multi-layers of conscientization. So we are using a critical pragmatist approach to it. And I'm not going to go too deep into the theoretical part, but what that means that we were working with our own curriculum. So my students had to learn that history so they could actually work with our partners, work with the schools, and start talking to the communities about the history that we are trying to uncover. Experiential learning in the community, that's extremely important. We were working with schools, but we were also working with community centers. We were talking to people in each of the communities, not just by publishing the weekly challenge, not just by working with the local media. We were going there face-to-face, having events all the time to talk to the communities about the history and asking them to bring more history for us. So whatever they have at home, pictures, documents, old newspapers, they would bring to us during these events, and we would talk to them about what we were finding and put all everything together. And sometimes even finding out there's some really great stories to tell. In one of the events with WSF, for example, as we were waiting for some people to get interviewed, 3 people walked at the same time through the door. One of them was one of our partners. They own a restaurant locally, and they were very good in telling the stories of the neighborhood. But he walked on the door with other 2 people. And the fun thing was that, well, the father of one of them was the doctor, and the mother of the other one was the nurse that delivered the restaurant owner in the local clinic for the Black population at the time. So they walked at the same time, and you had 3 generations of the history of St. Petersburg just walking the door at the same time. So these experiences also show to people that there's a lot more behind it than what people usually see. So we are working with community partners, but also with media partners. So WSF, the Weekly Challenger, Creative Loving were the first ones we've talked to. We tried to reach out to the Tampa Bay Times first. And at the beginning, they didn't want to work with us because they thought they were doing higher level of work. And then after a while, they started asking us for help to do the work that we were doing. So they start working with us in this project. More specifically, that's where the project called Tourist Town came from. Another thing that we were doing there is also trying to change the university itself and how we did research with the communities. And I think this is important for this talk specifically, because universities in general, they are seen as one of the elements that cause harm to marginalized communities. They are gentrifiers. They usually do research that people go into the neighborhoods, into the community, take information from people, sometimes very private information, and then they leave. And very rarely they bring something back. So from the beginning, one of the things that we did for this project and for the Neighborhood News Bureau as in general, everything we did, we made sure that all the data belonged to the communities. So everything that we did was not proprietary. The university could not claim that they have the copyrights of anything, because most of this is historical stuff that belongs to anyone else, to other people anyway. But even the work that we did in the Neighborhood News Bureau belong to the community. So one thing that we did was always create this website to make sure that everybody had access to all the data behind it. So we use a lot to create curriculum for the schools. And of course, work with the broader public. One of the things that besides working with professional media can only reach so many people. So a lot of what we did too was doing presentations to local groups. So one thing is to talk to the community here and talk about their history, but another thing is to bring the people who have power, the people who make decisions. And in every single one of those conversations that we had with them, remind them that they should be talking to people on the other side and not inviting them to the center of power, but they should go to South St. Petersburg. They should create the events in South St. Petersburg. That's all what we were trying to bring, get the people with power to South St. Petersburg to see what was going on there, to see the change that was coming from, not just from this project, but from everything that we were doing with our partners. So this is basically the approach we use. And now I want you to show you the actual site. So we started with these special projects with the NMB. The first thing I did with my students was this project called Voice of Midtown. It's based on a project the New York Times had a long time ago before Humans of New York. They had a project called 1 in 8 million that they talk to random people and they kind of follow them and have pictures and audio. So it was a really good way to teach my students to do multimedia production, but at the same time working with the history of the communities that we were talking about. I just hope this one's going to open, because this was a beautiful project, just partially. But at least you have the definition here a little bit. And here in this page, we had a list of talks, basically first person narrated snippets from 2 to 3 minutes, more or less, each one talking about a little bit of things that they thought were defining their lives. So we had a kindergarten teacher, and she was talking about how she worked with her students. At the same time, you had all this background audio of the students playing in the room, and you can see the pictures on how careful she was with the children, how much she really loved what she was doing. We had people who were activists talking about empowerment and giving speeches in empowerment. We had people who talk about, so these are actually the 2 stories I just mentioned. We had some people who were talking about personal experience. One person that came out of this Voice of Midtown and became part of Midtown 150 was a cook in a restaurant. And he was talking about how he learned to cook from his grandparents. and he was talking about the love that he put in his dishes and everything else. And Midtown 150 was actually a podcast series focused on food mostly. Food was a kind of the theme. So we had a bunch of different stories, but all of them touched in food in some kind of way. The Midtown edition, Telling Tampa Bay Stories, Telling Tampa Bay Stories is something that WSF had created, and we created the Midtown edition for WSF. So these are my students interviewing the people who lived in Midtown. And basically they were working with the radio journalists in recording these oral stories about what made Midtown, which is one of the neighborhoods in South St. Petersburg, Midtown. So they were talking about their experience when they were young, what they did. And from this is well, we created the first documentary in that page that I was showing to you here. So when you talk about NNB documentaries, that's where this Spa Beach controversy came from, because we were interviewing one person there and they mentioned that in Spa Beach is a beach that's right in downtown St. Petersburg, the one that's right near the pier. And of course, in the past, Black people couldn't go to that beach. So we actually found out that the person who was talking to us in this story knew the person who actually did the first intervention in Spa Beach. And they were basically a group of 16-year-old women that just decided to go to Spa Beach kind of on a whim. Say, no, we are going to integrate Spa Beach and we are going to do it now. And the three of them went there and they stayed there and then start bringing more people. And after a few, I think it took a couple of weeks for them to actually finally integrate and get to be accepted at Spa Beach. So everything that we did was already taking us to this point. And when we got to 2017 and we saw next year is going to be the 150 years project, why not put all of the stuff that we were already collecting in one place? So people who are researchers, historians, journalists, academics, or anyone who just want to know about the history of St. Petersburg, the Black history of St. Petersburg, can go and find it in one specific place and have all this information that might be helpful to them. Once we did that, again, that's kind of started the conversation with a bunch of different groups, because most of what we were doing is really trying to get the, and again, that's one of the problems that we have when people were hacking us when I was in NNB, the people were trying to take the website down a lot. And nowadays, because I'm not there and they are not keeping this website, so that's why I'm using the Wayback Machine. And we can't keep up with this, keep the site up all the time. But what we're really doing is bringing all these partners that were doing different things together. So it's a lot of what Elaine is doing with the collab, is bringing all these people together to bring good change, to bring good to the community, instead of just taking information from the community, start bringing back that information to the community in ways that they can use to do different things. One of the things that happened from this project, and when we start working on this, is that they had an election. And during the election, it was very controversial because there were a bunch of different parties trying to talk about the history of St. Petersburg. And that year was also the year that during the Martin Luther King Day, which they have a huge parade in St. Petersburg, and everybody in the South St. Petersburg comes to downtown. The police create a blockade between South St. Petersburg and downtown. And that's one of the reasons I want to show you the, where is it? Oh, here, the map. So if you look at the map here of St. Petersburg, you have this highway, which was one of the first things that they did to try to destroy the neighborhood. That was the most affluent African-American neighborhood in St. Petersburg, was right here. It was this area here. So they created a highway right here to make sure that they were creating a wall. And this highway here is not just a highway that's on top of kind of a bridge or something like that. It's an actual wall. The only way that you can get to South St. Petersburg is either to go to this side here or to go through an underpass right here on 22nd Street here. So this is the underpath right next to the museum that we work with. Trying to get. So this is 22nd Street. That's called the Deuces. This is one of the most historical, if not the most historical street in St. Petersburg. This is where they had more than 118 thriving businesses at a time between 5th Avenue South and 15th Avenue South. So in just these 10 blocks, they had 118, mostly black owned, but also Jew owned too, because Jewish people could not hold business in downtown St. Petersburg. So the racism was not just against the black people, was mostly against everybody at the time. And one of the things that we were finding out, because we were starting to look into the history of Tropicana Field, which came in the 80s, is that why did they put this stadium here at a time when they didn't have a baseball team? There was no baseball team in St. Petersburg. There was no reason to have a baseball stadium. But this came from a long, long time before. And we started looking at the history of the decision-making around basically urban changes in this area. And it's a very interesting parallel to the things that also happened in Providence, for example, is that they were moving people around. And every time they had a group of kind of community of Black people near downtown, they had to be removed to further south. And we start researching that, and we start working with the Tampa Bay Times at that point, looking at basically the documents of the decision makers and how they made a decision about this. And we found that even up the way to the Tropicana Field, up the way to the decision to make it, they say that they were going to actually create an industrial area here. They even called this area the industrial neighborhood here, because they were going to create jobs for the Black communities. And of course they didn't. And they removed all this area here that called Methodist Town, which was one of the richest and most vibrant communities in the Black community. So they created this wall, and then they finished removing everybody and creating this baseball field here. And as we were digging into the archives and going further and further back, we found what we call our aha moment, which was that's language that's being repeated and over again, explaining why they need to move the Black population from this area, the African American population from this area, somewhere else, especially south because of the wall here, right? So they need to keep going into the other directions here. And we found a letter. In 1930, the city, at the time, the town of St. Petersburg applied with the federal government to become a tourist town, which was basically one of the things that they were doing at the time, trying to bring tourists, especially from Europe, to bring money from Europe to the United States. And of course, St. Petersburg being a beach city was primed to do that. And 1930s, if you remember, that's kind of the same time that Disney was also started to invest money in Orlando. So they were already planning all this tourism in Florida. But the letter from the federal government back to St. Petersburg was, okay, we will give you the money, but you have to remove all the African American people from these areas where we want the tourists to be. And not only that, they were in the letters, in the language they were using right after it, and then they start changing a little bit. They were talking about creating reservations for the African Americans in St. Petersburg. So this is the kind of history that shows right from the beginning how this was planned. Because before everybody was using the excuse, no, this is not on purpose. We are not doing that on purpose. But the language was always very similarly explaining things in a way that was very close to something that was planned. And we just couldn't find that one document that started the whole thing until we did. So with the Tampa Bay Times, we found that document, and that would let us basically give us everything that was written in the decision making later, and the policies that they passed was explaining how they needed to move people from all this area here actually somewhere else. And of course, they have this. So that's why the segregation started even worse in the beginning. Because in the beginning, really in the beginning, before St. Petersburg was a city or was even incorporated in any way, when the first Black settlers arrived in this area here, they had their farms and they worked with the white people who were here, and there's no problem because there was basically a bunch of farms until the railroad came to St. Petersburg, and then the segregation started because white people started going to one direction and Black people started going to the other direction. But it wasn't that too much conflict until they started creating a plan that they really need to remove people by force if needed. So I think that's kind of the time that I have. So the last thing I want to show you in this project is that what we're building here is just the beginning of what we were really doing. And when you look at the African American Heritage Trail, what they're doing since then, when you see the digital trail that they created, and a lot of it was created by John Wilson and Wen Weiss, and my former student, Nicholas Laura Graham. All these projects that we're building from that, they were also building something else. And this, I think, is the most important part of what we were doing, is that we were bringing different groups of people from the white neighborhoods, people with money, liberal progressives that they wanted to help, but they didn't know how because they didn't want to cross that pathway. And we were bringing them to South St. Petersburg for a bunch of different events and talk to people, and people who were already organized in South St. Petersburg, but they didn't have a way to get heard without, in a way, even sometimes with violence, but not violence like killing people but making almost a riot sometimes, but mostly protests to get people to hear, and then people think of them as radicals. So what we were trying to do is break that image of being radicals, but actually they were thinkers and they were activists, and they were organizing to change the city to the better, not just for the African American neighborhood, the whole city for the better. And we start putting all these people together, and that culminated with St. Petersburg finally electing the first Black mayor in its history, right the year after I left. So this is the work that we do with journalism in many ways, is to bring this community together, to bring people together, to get them to talk to each other. Is what an author that I really appreciate from the University of St. Petersburg, Robert Dardenne, called the conversation of journalism. Is how you get people who are in completely different areas of life, doing completely different things, and start talking to each other to see how can we come together to do something better. How can we overcome this idea of hate or even the fear? Because I think most often what you have is fear, because people said South St. Petersburg was dangerous, it was dangerous, it was dangerous. White people wouldn't go there. And then I start taking white people there, and people would say, oh, this is actually really nice. And then there were events, there were a bunch of things happening there, and they were coming, and we were bringing the media with us so they could show, see, this is not about violence, there's no crime here. It's not there's no crime at all, but comparing to downtown St. Petersburg, for example, there's much less crime in South St. Petersburg, and the type of crime that happens in South St. Petersburg would not affect anyone coming from downtown. While in downtown, it affected everybody because everybody was could be a victim of the crimes. So a lot of it is trying to heal the misconceptions that we have of each other and each group of people and bring them together to work on something. So we work with the Holocaust Museum, with the Carter Woodson Museum, with the St. Pete Museum right in downtown St. Petersburg, and try to create things that will bring all these groups together. And In 5 years, you could see a huge change. You don't need that much. When you talk about polarization in politics today, you don't need that much time to fix it, but you need to start somewhere. You need to get people, especially in the media, when you talk about COVID elections today, the project that we have with Communities of Hope now is exactly that. It's, let's talk about politics, but let's not talk about candidates as celebrities. Let's talk about what brings people together, what people need in their communities. So I'll stop here and see if you have questions.
Thank you so much, Bernardo. I will ask folks to please do put your questions into the Q&A, and Bernardo, I have a lot of questions for you during that talk. So while folks are getting their questions organized, I think maybe I'll take the liberty of hosting, and that comes with being the host, and ask you a question. You know, I thought it was really interesting, your discussions about journalism and history and the relationship between these two endeavors. And you described journalism as a conversation, right? And history is also often described as a conversation, right? The historiography is one big conversation between present and past, between historians and the public. And I thought I would take advantage also of your screensaver, your background there that talks about your current project, Communities of Hope. And it seems that I see some parallels, or perhaps some connections between the work that you were doing with the Neighborhood News Bureau and with Communities of Hope. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about Communities of Hope and the relationship of that here, and work that you guys are thinking about doing here in Rhode Island. And I see some questions coming in, and we'll get to those in a sec. Thanks.
Okay. So very quickly, so we can get to those questions too, and we can come back to talk about Communities of Hope. I would love to do that. Communities of Hope is, the way I describe it is Neighborhood News Bureau on steroids. It's because when I got to the Neighborhood News Bureau, it already existed. It was dormant, but it existed. Someone else had created and had created a structure for it, and I had to work within that structure. So in Communities of Hope, I I'm using right now everything that I learned from that experience to try to do a better version of the Neighborhood News Bureau. And a lot of it has to do with history or telling history, because that's one of the things that every community tells us that they need. When they say, what do you need? First, they want to know, to hear their own histories, because nobody's telling that. Not just stories, but histories. Meaning they want to know their path. The past. They really know if they contributed something. So here in Rhode Island, you have so many groups that came to Rhode Island different times for different reasons, and they all participated in building this state for what it is today. And many times when you look at the actual history, the official history of Rhode Island, many of these groups are forgotten or erased. Right? Probably sometimes not even by on purpose, but by the lack of connection between the historians who were telling those stories and the historians who are living in those neighborhoods. So one of the first things we did was a program called Hope Pod that was talking about the reurbanization of Providence and how that reurbanization moved ethnic groups of people from place to place. Very similar to what happens in Petersburg, but with some undertones of racism, of course, but not necessarily because Providence wanted to be a tourist town, but also with this idea of trying to clean the area, the urban areas, to create some more urban development and things like that. But it always the poor and the ethnic neighborhoods are the ones who suffer when you do that. So that's what we try to do with Communities of Hope. And now the elections we're doing Hope Pod, Eco Talk. I'm going to actually put the page here so all of you can start looking. I don't think I have the link for everybody. So Elaine, if you can show that to the participants. I think I can show only to the two of you. You are muted.
Oh, yep. always, right? Yeah, so I'll make sure folks can get a hold of that. So we do have some questions coming in from the chat. Our first question says, thank you for your talk, very powerful work. Can you tell us a bit about how the mainstream news entities in the area reacted to the Community Neighborhood News Bureau? Did that change over time? Did they acknowledge the work that was being done and offer to share resources, etc.?
Okay, very simply put is that most of the larger mainstream news, they didn't want to acknowledge that we existed at the beginning. So we started working with the Weekly Challenger, and because we also had contact with WSF, and that was a huge breakthrough because they were already considered a mainstream news outlet. When we had that first event with WSF, then other people started paying attention, and they saw that we were working with Weekly Challenger and Creative Loafing, which are considered small newspapers comparatively. But the Tampa Bay Times didn't want to talk to us at all. I knocked at the door many times, and they say, well, we are working with people from New York, from Chicago, and we don't need you, until we start doing these events and start showing to the Tampa Bay Times that one of the reasons they were not getting any more people to read them is because they were not covering them properly. And not just now, historically. They were not the worst historically, but there was another newspaper that was actually owned by a white supremacist that was basically a bunch of vitriol kind of information about South St. Petersburg, but they were not doing great at all. They tried a few things that didn't work, and they kept trying many things that didn't work. And what I told them was that you can't be talking about South St. Petersburg from downtown St. Petersburg. You have to go there. And I have students who are there. So they start hiring my students, and my students inside start writing those stories. And then that's when the editors start paying attention, and we got a few new editors who were already looking for that kind of stories, and then we start working together. So by the time I left, I think all the major media was actually looking forward to work with us. So, but it's a work. Again, it took us 5 years to get to that point.
Thank you. I have a question here from Paula. It says, how do you foresee extending this type of community engagement and applied learning model to the Communities of Hope initiative, which you've addressed a little bit? But I also thought it'd be interesting to maybe, if I can take another moderator liberty and if you could talk a little bit about the impact this had on your students too, maybe, and or even some of the students you've already worked with here, this model of engagement in education for students entering journalism.
I will not speak for them, but I will speak to things that they have told me in different ways, and for the work that they are doing. So many of my former students, they are doing exactly the same kind of work that we were doing in Neighborhood News Bureau back where they are now. I have students in the Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, and that's the kind of work that they are doing. And the students that are even here in Communities of Hope, what they want to do is this restorative work. It's community driven. It's journalism that actually matters to people, that actually works with people. And of course, we have a specific group of people that we work with, which always try to reach out the most marginalized. They might not be working with the most marginalized, but they know that when they are doing a story, that there are voices that people usually forget because they're not easy to find. It's more work sometimes because you have to go to them. There are people who can't leave their homes. So that's one of the lessons that my students learned right from the pandemic too. Now, hey, nobody can leave their homes now. So how does that feel? Imagine when everybody could leave their homes and you were one of the people who couldn't, or not just their homes, but where they are. Or sometimes they don't even have a home. So where do you find them? How do you talk to them? And that's what they're learning, how to bring people into the mainstream conversation. We are using this metaphor for talking about marginalized people in the mainstream. We're really folding, so they're in the margins, and we are folding them onto the mainstream by bringing those stories, bringing those questions they have, the needs they have to the politicians who are candidates now. So kind of forcing them to answer, forcing them to at least acknowledge the existence of those groups of people. So as far as I see, almost every single one of my students that I still have contact with, used some of that in their work, or they're using, some of them are doing even better. Some of them became solution journalists for newspapers. Some of them became the community engagement person for a news media and things like that. So
Thank you.
it's a movement.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Next question is says, fascinating to learn about the background of NNB and to see the model that informs the Communities of Hope initiative. I know you're in early days with Communities of Hope, but are there elements of the model that you developed in Florida that have been difficult to replicate and or adapt to Rhode Island and Roger Williams University?
Well, there were a couple of things that were very hard. One, it's really bad, but at the same time, for our work is really good that in St. Petersburg, we knew exactly where people were. You cross that underpath and then you are in African American St. Petersburg. So we knew where to find people in from the groups that we were working with. And we were very specifically working with the Black community there. In Community of Hope, we are talking about communities plural. We're talking about different communities of different types of different, we're not talking about ethnicity, we're talking about all kinds of marginalized communities. So we're talking about the disabled, we're talking about the incarcerated population, we're talking about the houseless. And we're trying to do that during the pandemic. So that is not replicable. We can't just put a newsroom in one place, find all of them. And that's another problem that we had, is that we couldn't get even the newsroom in the communities. So that's what we are working on now, and trying to find ways to have a presence in different communities by doing partnerships. And we're still talking to the Providence campus to see if we can find space there that we can use more permanently.
Thank you. We have another question about the reactions of the students when they research the city as well, even if they're not from there, maybe particular, or they come from somewhere nearby. I don't know if it sounds like, I don't know if it sounds like maybe the population is relatively local at the university that you are working with versus from very, very far afield. But I think that kind of piggybacks on that earlier question is, and I think a question too is, as an educator, you know, how do you help the students navigate the difficult kind of truths that they encounter pretty, in very stark terms when they're doing this work, and as journalists and as, public historians essentially as well.
So I even like that you said public historians, because that's kind of the approach we do. So the critical pragmatic approach is that we do it, we don't talk about it. So they're seeing the history. It's not something that they can argue one way or another. They're seeing the document, they're talking to the people who've been suffering the consequences of that history. They see every day in their work, and some of them get that kind of almost Zen enlightenment sometimes. I had a student who lived 30 years in St. Petersburg, and she never crossed to South St. Petersburg. And when she crossed to South St. Petersburg, she was so amazed that she wanted to do a whole documentary just about the crossing, just about stepping to the other side, because it's a completely different world. And you can see it's the way the city is laid out and everything else changes completely. Here it's kind of the same thing. Rhode Island, it's a small state, it's a very small state, but it's very insular. So every single, almost every mile of Rhode Island, you are in a different community, and they don't necessarily look like each other. So they have different backgrounds, they have different histories. And when the students are learning about that, they get this sense of, wow, there's a lot more here than I could even imagine. And when we talk about marginalized communities specifically, is that many times they didn't even think about it. So one of the projects that we have with Communities of Hope is called Transforming Roger. And we're talking to the staff members in Roger Williams, talk about their lives, where they are from, where they live, what the quality of life they have. And the students start realizing, wait a minute, I didn't even see this person before. And now there is a whole human being here in front of me. So that changes people little by little. I don't have to do a lot, because once you start this, it's praxis. It's just, they learn by doing. And the whole realization comes with the contact, with the conversation, with that realization that there is another human being on the other side.
Thank you. And we have a question as well about how current challenges to journalists and journalism affect projects like the one you did in St. Petersburg, as well as the Community of Hope initiative here in Rhode Island. You've already alluded to some of those challenges with your website, for example.
Yeah. So in St. Petersburg, we did have, well, anyone who knows Florida knows that some of the center of the white supremacy movement comes from there, and comes from just a few miles from St. Petersburg, near the Orlando area. That's where some of the websites and some of the most technical communication and organization of these groups is coming from. So even the Neighborhood News Bureau is not an activist site. It's not, and it's just history and journalism. But we're not doing any kind of political engagement or anything like that. That's loud or anything like that. But even that is threatening, because knowledge of history is threatening to them, because they have to trust on a lie, and they have to spread the lie. And one thing that's what's happening at that time is that the son of one of these groups, trying to remember his name every time I try to, it's Derek Black. He decided, he was one of the mastermind of using social media and games to spread hate on the internet. And at some point, because he was talking to his friends, and his friends were really trying to convince him that he was wrong, he was showing the research that he had, and people were showing the research that so no, that's not true, that has been debunked. And it was a long process, and he was explaining that. But he was right there. He was in less than 50 miles from St. Petersburg. So that's one thing. The other thing is institutional interest, not just of the university, but institutional interest in the sense that in journalism, someone has to pay the bill. Usually you think that as the audience, you're creating a product that the audience is going to pay for. But we are working for communities that are not going to pay that. They can't afford that. On the contrary, part of what we are trying to do is give money to them, give the resources to them. So we do a lot of training, paid training, but we have to find the people who can support this work and find the importance of this work. So a lot of it is also telling our own stories. There's a part that I wasn't very good with Neighborhood News Bureau, and I got much better now. So many of the students that we have a group of public relations students working on not just telling the stories of the communities, but also telling the stories of communities of hope. So we can get people who have that money, who have the power to make decisions in that way. But also we have an advantage now that, as I said, there's a movement. It's not just solution journalism. It's not just community-driven journalism, not just transformative journalism. It's all of those movements coming together. We just participated in Democracy Day from the Center for Cooperative Media. And they had, I think it was 300 newsrooms doing the same type of work. And the work was listening to communities and talking about what kind of resources we can bring to those communities during election time. Every single newsroom has a different approach, but they're all invested in the same idea that we don't work for the people who have money, we work for the community we serve. And then we figure out how to fund that for those communities. And many of those newsrooms are doing that now. They're actually getting more money than the old media. So the old media is actually going out, mostly because of economic woes, while you have INN, which is the Institute for Nonprofit News. In the last 10 years, I think that was the number, or five years, they have more than 300 newsrooms opening in the United States alone. And this is a global movement. So you can imagine that in many of those, I even show that to my students, they pay better sellers to their reporters. So they can afford better sellers because they consider the reporters part of the community they are serving. So they can't chip change them in the work, or they were going to leave. They have to actually be part of the community. They have to be able to live in the community and help the community stay there too.
Great, thanks. And our last question is about how you envision communities of hope supporting Roger Williams' really deliberate sort of strategic focus on community engaged learning, and for your own students, as well as for the community, right? Because community engaged learning is a reciprocal process. So if you want to talk a little bit about the vision for that as our final question.
So right now, Alan Hens is here in this group here. We've been working with him from the beginning. So we are working with the Community Engagement Center. So we have students who are basically, right now we use a lot of work to study students, because there is money for that and there's not enough jobs for them. So we are providing a lot of those jobs. One part of it is we started with 4 or 5 students, Communities of Hope, and in less than 2 years, we're moving to 30 per semester. And for next year, the goal is 50. So and all the students are in the community. So they are learning to tell the stories of those communities and bring back to Roger Williams, right? So we are working with the Hawks Herald, for example, the publications that we are doing for the elections. Hawks Herald is one of the first publications, but they also have other partners that are publishing the stories. So the students are working with our partners in different ways, working with those communities, learning from them, and bring those stories back to Roger Williams. So we can do presentations like this one, but we can also use that to create curriculum. So the same way we were doing NNB, create curriculum for our local schools. I just had a meeting with a local school in Providence. I'm not going to mention the name yet until we close the deal, but we were supposed to work out a way for them to get internships with Communities of Hope, like for 2 or 3, and 13 students showed up. So now it's not an internship anymore, it's a program. So now we have a team of students in that high school that we are going to be working and training them to actually do stories with their communities. And not just locally in Rhode Island, we are doing this both nationally and internationally. So we are offering programs like Hope Squad and Hope Lab, that training programs for journalists. This year, we are focusing on high school journalists, but Hope Lab is open to any, Hope Lab is for the teachers in high school this year, but it's open for any group that needs training, and we can work with them to create the type of news media that we were talking about as transformative journalism. So local, owned by the community, owned by the members of the community, to create a transformative experience. So it's not just bringing that change to Roger Williams, it's bringing that change also from Roger Williams to all these other areas too, and trying to make Roger Williams a part of that change. Things that we hear a lot, as I said, sometimes institutions can be harmful to the communities they are, because universities, for example, they take a lot of land and they make things expensive around them. So we have to be careful. We have to also be, as an institution, we have to be able to bring value to those communities, but for the people who live there, not just for the land. So that's part of the work we're doing too.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Bernardo. I think your talk and your work is a really just sort of apt illustration of the work of telling hidden truths about and our series title, in communities, in Florida and in Rhode Island and beyond. So thank you so much for sharing your work with us, and to our audience, thank you all very much. We have some accolades coming in on the Q&A. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And please stay tuned for our next installment of the Hidden Truth series, which will take place in November and feature our colleague, Anjali Ram. So good night, everyone, and have a good rest of your week.
Thank you very much. And good night.